Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Genrick, who has claimed Britain faces the fight of our generation against extremists. He warns that police are giving in to Islamists because it is too challenging to confront them. The Shadow Justice Secretary didn't hold off saying that unless Islamists were challenged, the government and police risked ceding control of the country and its streets. Really, really strong words, front page of a couple of newspapers today. So very, very curious to what you make about this story. Does Robert Genrick have a point? I mean, he's got a reputation for saying these things, hasn't he, to get headlines, and it works, to be fair. So does he have a point, or is he scaremongering? Joined in the studio by two wonderful political commentators. Don't all shout at me, you know. Matthew Stadlen, all right, hold it. Go. No, put the comments in. And Benedict Spence. Now, gentlemen, very, very big story. Robert Genrick, as we know, has form for saying controversial things. But coming to you first, Matthew, does he have a point?
Does he have a point that we are involved in a battle for the soul of our country over Islamism?
Well, the headline is police are giving in to Islamists.
Well, there are certainly big questions that have been asked, and rightly so, of West Midlands police around how they handled the Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa game in the autumn. And I await with interest the verdict of the Home Affairs Select Committee. So we'll see what happens there. Definitely important questions being asked. And if it is decided that the West Midlands police were involved in the banning of fans from Israel, not because those fans represented a specific threat that justified their exclusion, but because local groups were threatening those fans and the police
The local groups being
people who were against what was happening in Gaza, but violently so. I don't know who those local groups might have been.
I think we can mostly identify them as being Muslims in Birmingham who did say they were going to protest and did make threats.
Whoever they were Muslims and non-Muslims, whatever, totally unacceptable if they were threatening violence against anyone. And if the reason these fans were banned was to protect the fans from local groups, that's obviously totally unacceptable, in my view, because the police is there to police without fear or favour and to protect the innocent. Now, of course, we know that some of these Maccabi fans did do some terrible stuff in Amsterdam, and they were also the victims of terrible stuff.
There wasn't a single Maccabi Tel Aviv fan arrested in Amsterdam.
I saw some footage of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans behaving badly. What I am concerned about here, the overall story, is what Robert Genrick is up to. My view, and if he were here, he could give a very different view, I'm sure, is that he's desperate for attention. He's desperate for a wedge issue, and he was very disappointed not to win the Tory leadership. I wouldn't be that surprised if he ends up defecting to Reform, and unless he thinks that he can win over the Tory leadership again and have another bite at it. But the idea that we're in the battle for a soul of the country, we have 4 million Muslims roughly in the UK, and that's 6-7% of the population. Some of those, a small minority, represent undoubtedly a threat to us.
Absolutely.
Let's deal with that. Let's not tar either, and I'm not saying he is here, but let's not tar all Muslims with that brush. And let's be careful, because in the article he leaps from his criticism of Islamism, fine, so long as you are actually talking about Islamists, to what he describes as this experiment in mass immigration.
Right, OK, let's bring you in on this one, Benedict. Benedict, what do you make it? Does Robert Genrick have a point, or is Matthew, who can't even use the word Muslim to describe the people who are causing unrest or threatening to cause unrest in Birmingham, which is an interesting point, kind of backing up what Genrick says, does Genrick have a point, or is he just getting headlines?
I think, actually, that the question of the identity of the individuals in this instant, whilst that's relevant to the Maccabi Tel Aviv story, is irrelevant in the broader issue, which is fundamentally, what is this about? It's a police force that doesn't have the resources to do its job. That's ultimately, I think, what the big takeaway is, because I don't think it would matter if it was...
In the Maccabi Tel Aviv story.
In the Maccabi Tel Aviv story, but also more broadly. I think that all of this feeds into a perception that we have in this country, which is that police officers don't do their jobs, which is that police forces don't do their jobs. And ultimately, what I think a lot of this is, a police force trying to find an excuse for not being able to do its job without telling the truth. Because if it told the truth, well, then it would be open season, wouldn't it? It would be a bit like, do you remember at the start of Keir Starmer's administration where he said we put too many people in prisons and we need a completely different approach because the prisons are full? And then suddenly there was a massive surge in crime and everybody sort of realised, oh, hang on a minute, the government slightly jumped the shark. I think police forces, I think in this case, referring to the Maccabi Tel Aviv incident, it is related to local Muslim organisations. Islamist organisations is perhaps the best way of framing it, but undoubtedly there is a certain militancy there in some of these groups that you might not find elsewhere. So that is relevant to this part of the story. But I reckon if you were to sort of replicate this in other parts of the country to do with other things, be it, I don't know, organised crime in, say, Oxfordshire, where there is a large amount of fly tipping going on and all sorts of things, and you hear the police coming up with all sorts of different reasons, the reality is, what they're not saying is they don't have the resources, the manpower, or maybe the will to deal with any of this, and because they won't admit that, they're going to come up with any excuse to not therefore do their jobs.
If it was just the Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa thing, if it was just a case of we don't have the manpower, why not say that?
Because
why not say
then you are
Maccabi Tel
admitting
Aviv fans are violent, we're worried about how they...
It would be a bit like if the NYPD had turned round in sort of the 60s and said, well, we can't deal with the mafia, we don't have enough people. What do you think happens then? Suddenly then it's open season. Organised groups take advantage of a police force that says we're weak and we can't do anything. So they have to come up with alternatives. And the problem is, of course, then trust is lost in the police, because what has happened in this case is very clearly examples of police not doing the right thing, jumping through hoops and now being found out and now trying to cover themselves. But of course, if they were to just admit it, this is what we did and this is the reason why, well, then everybody will be going, that's an actual breakdown of the system.
Well, we're aware that there's a breakdown of the situation, I think, mainly because of the way this one's been handled. What about the other story this week that backs up Robert Genrick, Matthew? The UAE are so worried about students being radicalised in British universities, they've withdrawn the funding package for poorer students to come to this country to study because they're worried they're going to get... A Muslim country is worried Muslim kids are going to get radicalised in the UK. That backs up Genrick, doesn't it?
To what extent? If there
To the fact that kids get radicalised in our university by Islamists. And we have Arab countries worried about that.
So the UAE is perfectly entitled to do exactly what it wants when it comes to dishing out its scholarships. I think there are, 400 or 500...
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about the numbers.
Let me just make the point. There are about 400 or 500 people a year, roughly, who come over from the UAE, and they've now withdrawing this scholarship. They are totally entitled to be concerned about what they want to be concerned about. Do I know whether what they're concerned about has any basis in reality? No, because I'm not an expert in what goes on in British universities. If there is radicalisation going on in British universities, or indeed in any part of our society, then that needs to be countered. And we do have various schemes that attempts to counter extremism in this country. I have no time for extremists of any sort. I've got no time for Islamist extremists, Islamist fascism, Islamist terrorism. Of course not. But is there a real problem with radicalisation in our universities? I simply don't know. What I do see, because I use the app still, although I think it's dying because a lot of people on the centre-left have just left, is on X, I see people getting radicalised in various different ways. You can easily see how people would get radicalised to become extremist Islamists, and you could easily see how people are getting radicalised to become on the extreme right in our country.
The Emiratis have been talking about this actually for some time. It's not a new thing. They've been talking about it for almost a decade, which is the radicalisation that's going on. And this is more a sort of an Islamist-specific topic, I think, than the Birmingham one. And that is because actually of a real... Despite the fact that many people in the United Kingdom like to say that we are an open and tolerant nation, actually, fundamentally, many liberals don't know the first thing about the communities that they're inviting in. And this is always a problem when you hear people refer to, say, the Muslim community. There's no such thing. There's many different communities within that. And, what is, the perspective of, say, an Arab who lives off the Edgware Road is going to be very different to, say, somebody who's of Pakistani origin in Birmingham, because their mosques preach different things, their outlook is very different, they come from different parts of the world. It is not a homogenous group. But this is an important point, and that is that a lot of, I think, British liberals, because they're very unaware of the nature of how societies around the Middle East and North Africa actually operate, Allah Abdel Fattah, the Egyptian person who was given British citizenship, is a very good example of this. It was sort of taken as read that this man, because he was being imprisoned by the Egyptian regime and was portrayed as a political dissident, must therefore be a good guy because the Egyptian regime is a lot more sort of hardline than we would like it to be in the West. The problem is, of course, what is the alternative to the current Egyptian regime? It's the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is an awful lot of Islamist extremism that goes on there. So we, our country rather, in a very naive way goes, well, of course, he must be the good guy because he's facing down a pretty authoritarian regime. The reality is, often the authoritarian regimes, and we see this in the Gulf as well and across North Africa, are authoritarian, at least in part, because the alternative is radicalised groups, and this can be on the left or the right or Islamists. There's a lot of that. If we then import that to the United Kingdom, in some cases you get very moderate communities, moderate mosques, in the same way that you get moderate or Haredi Jewish communities. You know, you get different people with different communities, different views. On the other hand, you do also get radicalised ones. And the thing is, of course, Islamists, because it is a political movement as well as a religious one, they do go out and look and recruit people who are influential. And that means the children of wealthy Emiratis.
Quickly, we are running out of time.
No, I just sort of back up something that Benedict said, which is that there is no homogenous Muslim community.
No one said there was.
There's an extent to it. A lot of people want to portray Muslims as one big group.
We're talking about radical Islam here.
Everyone is against radical Islam, unless you're a radical Islamist. Islam, there is an extent to which Islam is at war with itself. If you think of Shia and Sunni factionism, and then you get, as Benedict says, a whole myriad of other ways of expressing being a Muslim.
But I do think that extremism in the UK, extremist Islamist tendencies, certainly within universities, is a very large problem,
right,
I think is what I should say.
Where it's a problem, it needs to be clamped down on. Where it's a problem, let's be very clear, someone on the centre-left, where there is an Islamist problem, it needs to be countered with the full weight of the state.
Does the UK have an Islamist problem? Yes or no?
We certainly have Islamist extreme Islam in this country. Of course we do.
And is it a problem?
We've been the victims of it. Because we have it, it is a problem.
Yes
and
or no, is it a problem?
Yes, of course it is. And the security services work around the clock to counter it.
My answer is yes as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much.